Hello and welcome to NL's online guitar lesson series. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, we're going to learn lots of awesome stuff from the very beginning of the guitar. So you're going to learn how to hold the instrument, you're going to learn how to play the instrument, and you're going to learn, hopefully, how to think about the guitar moving forward. Before we get started playing the guitar, it's really important to get warmed up. We want to make sure that we have lots of blood moving through our shoulders, our arms, our hands, and our fingers especially. That will help to keep us nice and loose, it will help to make it easier to play, and it will help to prevent injury. So there's lots of movements we can do to make that happen, and here's a few of them now. We can start off just by shaking our arms. We can shake one arm at a time, or we can shake both arms. Feels a little bit silly just to do it on your own, but it doesn't really matter. Just to get your arms moving, to get blood moving through them. You can also roll your shoulders back and forward. A lot of people forget about the shoulders, but when we play guitar, our shoulders are moving into different positions, and you can get quite stiff if you're not nice and loosened off. The next thing to do would be to shake our wrists. Again, just to get the blood flowing through them, get used to moving through different ranges of motion in our wrists, and we can roll them around in circles as well, just to stretch off all the tendons and ligaments and muscles that control our hand. And we can also do the same thing with our fingers. We can wiggle our fingers to get them nice and warmed up, and we can stretch them in and out like this, just to make sure that we're nice and warm. We can even stretch our hands out like this, or if you feel like it, every individual finger as well, just to make sure that you're nice and loose. Even something as simple as rubbing your hands together can help to warm them up and get you ready to play. Just play around with all these movements, maybe make up some of your own, and try to build a little routine that works well for you. So most guitarists won't do a set routine before they play every time, but almost everybody will have a little bit of a shake off, will have a little bit of a loosen off, because it really does help. Now that we're nice and warmed up, let's get cracking on with the lesson. Hello and welcome to NL's online guitar lessons. This is lesson number 4, and today we're going to be looking at changing between chords and chord charts. So if you saw our last video, then you know about chord shapes, the different shapes that we make with our hands to get different sounds, to get different combinations of notes. We call these combinations of notes chords. Now, it can be kind of tricky on guitar to get used to playing chords. Some chords are easier than others, but all chords take practice. With time, you will get good at playing each chord individually, especially if you've been doing the exercises that we spoke about in our last lesson. But once you're good at playing each chord individually, the next step is to string chords together and play them one after the other. And that needs a little bit of practice all on its own. In most songs and in most music, we play several chords one after the other. Sometimes these can be cyclical, so they can go round and round. We can go from one chord to another, to one chord to another. Sometimes we move between 4 chords all in a row, and then back to the start. Sometimes we play different chords all the time, no idea why. Like, sometimes it can be super complicated. But most of the time, we just pick from a standard list of chords, and every song has a little list, and we move through that list as the song goes on. This is called a chord progression, when one chord moves to another. And the sequence of chords within a song can be called that song's chord progression. Usually a song will have one progression for the verse, one progression for the chorus, one for the verse, one for the chorus, one for the bridge, and then one for the chorus again. Each section of the song will have its own progression. Chord progressions to songs are not unique at all. In fact, certain progressions are so common that they can be found in lots and lots and lots of songs, and you can look those up. There's kind of joke montages of them because it is so obvious when you know how to recognize it. So that means that if you just learn a few chords and how to move between them, all of a sudden you'll be able to play loads and loads of awesome songs, which is all the better for us. To start off with right now, we're going to look at a very simple progression and how to work through it. This progression here starts with a D chord. And if you remember our previous lesson, a D chord looks like this. If you're good at that chord and you can go into it from cold, or if you can go into it from a reset like we spoke about, then the next step is to move to a different chord. In this case, we're going to go to a G chord. Now, all of a sudden, that becomes very tricky because you have to hold two different shapes in your head. You have to be playing the D, but you have to be thinking about where your fingers are going to go for the G. And in the beginning, this is usually a kind of clumsy, fumbling process. It's perfectly normal to trip over it. You're going to have moments where you're not sure. You're going to have moments where you think you're doing the right thing, but it's not quite. You're going to have moments of uncertainty. It's all part of the process. It just takes practice. There are a couple of things we can do, though, that make it a bit easier to change from one chord to the other. The first thing that we can do is look for anchor points. And what do I mean by anchor points? Well, that is, we're looking for the fingers that don't have to move. If I play these chords one after the other, you'll notice that one of my fingers isn't moving. That is my ring finger, my third finger. It stays on the third fret of the B string, the second string, this one here. So these two chords have this note in common, and they play it with the same finger. And that means that I can use this as an anchor. This is going to be my reference point for all my other fingers. I know where it is in the D chord, and with a bit of practice, I know where it is on the G chord. And this can be my pivot to move between both chords. Now, if you really look for it, you'll find pivot notes everywhere. You'll find these little anchor points between chords. Of course, if I move from D to a different chord, then that anchor point no longer exists, or it may no longer exist, because that new chord might not share the same note. Now I have to move my fingers. Not all chords will have anchor notes, but it can be really useful to look for them. It can speed up your learning of certain progressions. The next chord in this progression is an E minor chord. And you can see that E minor doesn't share any fingers in common with G. We do have a note in common, which is here, the second fret of the fifth string, but I play it with a different finger in each example, in each chord. I could play an E minor like this, and that would mean that this becomes a pivot note, but it's not essential. Usually I play an E minor like this, and that means that I need to move all my fingers. So there isn't really a cheat for this. There's no way to make it easier other than brute force repetition, which is always a good tool. So for this change, just practice making the change as best you can. And it really is about getting repetition. So you want to get more and more practice. As always, when you're fretting the chords, try and make sure that they ring out clearly and that you're not getting any buzzes or any dead notes. When you're changing chords as well, you want to minimize the dead air between the chords. So what I mean by that is if I play a G and then I get confused and forget where my E is and then, oh yeah, there it is, and I play my E, then that's a lot of dead space between the chords. And if I'm playing with other people, well, they're not going to wait for me to figure out where to put my fingers, are they? So you need to practice getting that fast and getting it smooth. So just work on that one. And then our next chord coming up is an A major chord. Now, that doesn't share any fingerings with an E minor chord. This is my A major. You can see E minor, A major. It doesn't necessarily share any fingerings, but what it does share is a bit of a shape. You see that these two fingers here, they have the same shape. So although they move, they stay the same in relation to each other. So that's the second tool that we can use to make changing between chords a little bit easier, is to look for these common shapes. A really good example is E major and A minor. If I play an E major chord and I just move everything down one string, it becomes an A minor chord. So here, although I'm not actually keeping any of my fingers in the same place, the whole shape stays the same and I just move it all down. So that can be really useful to remember. Sometimes the whole chord won't stay the same, as in our E minor to A major example. But it can be useful to just point out little parts that do stay the same. Just like with a pivot note, not every note stays the same, but one note stays where it is. Well, here, the whole shape doesn't necessarily remain, but part of it does, and that can speed up the change. Now, so far, I've just been speaking about major and minor chords. And to be honest, in this lesson, we don't really have the time to explain the difference between them and exactly how they're made. That's for a different time. For now, I'm just going to speak about how major and minor chords are written. Major chords are usually just written with their letter name. So if it's a C major chord, I would just write a big capital uppercase C. It's assumed that a chord is major because that is the default for a chord. So if you don't give any other information, you just assume that it's a major chord. Minor chords are written with a lowercase m after their letter. So a C minor chord would be uppercase C and then lowercase m. And that way we know to turn it into a minor chord. Once you're able to move between all the chords in this example, you can start to practice it a little bit faster. You can try and improve it and make it smooth and slick and get rid of any buzzes or dead notes that you find. And the last thing you can do, once this is an absolute scoosh for you, is to make up your own chord progressions. So we already have a little repertoire of chords that we can play. If you look at the previous examples from previous videos, or if you remember them from your practice, we have lots of chords available to us with which to build progressions. So we can just move between the different chords that we know. If I say D minor to G, to E minor, to A minor, to F major 7, to G 6, to A major. You see, it's a little bit of an exercise to just come up with chords and be forced to transition between them. But it's a really good exercise for getting good at that transition. Well, thanks very much for tuning into today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope that you learned an awful lot. Just as we finish our lesson today, we're going to round it off the same way as we started, with some stretches and some cool down movements. This is again just to make sure that we stay nice and loose now that we're finished, that we don't cramp up or get sore, and that means that we can play even better tomorrow. Okay, so a lot of the same movements we did at the start, we can do now. We can roll our shoulders, we can shake off our arms, we can roll our wrists, and we can stretch off our fingers. Just like at the beginning, the key thing is to keep things moving, to keep things warm and stretched off. With all that done, all that's left is to say thank you very much for joining us today at NL Guitar Lessons Online. Please check out some of our other content and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.